Good evening, colleagues and friends. Bonsoir, chers collègues et nos autres amis. It is a pleasure to have you with us tonight to launch the first volume of Jonathan Frocko's bilingual Œuvres complètes de Geoffrey Chaucer. C'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir ce soir afin de lancer le premier tome des Œuvres complètes de Geoffrey Chaucer, édition bilingue par Jonathan Frocko. My name's Amy Brown, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern. I'm researching on the project Canonicity, Obscenity, and the Making of Modern Chaucer, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation and run by Prof. Dr. Mary C. Flannery. Jonathan's Tome 1 contains absolutely none of Chaucer's famously dirty work, but as scholars working on and teaching Chaucer in bi- and trilingual contexts, we are very enthusiastic about this multilingual Middle English Modern French edition and translation project, and are delighted to host the launch tonight. The event will be, for the most part, conducted in English, which I'm sure you're very glad to hear, given that after 18 months in Bern in a pandemic, my spoken French is rather rusty and picking up some very strange accent. Before we get to the good part of this evening, some housekeeping notes. The event is a webinar, so the only people you can see on the camera are the people who are invited speakers this evening. We are very sorry that we cannot see your faces in the audience, but as the event is being recorded, that does mean you don't have to worry about whether you're on camera and whether serious academics will see your Friday evening pajamas. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see the Q&A function and the chat function. You can use the chat function if you need to make a statement that both panel and attendees can see. I'm unsure what such a statement might be, but it's there. You can also use that to send a direct message to me, particularly if something's wrong with the tech, or perhaps you might want to send it to host and panelists so that anyone amongst us can see it and speak up. The Q&A you can also use throughout the evening to register a question for any of the panelists. And I think there's a function where you can sort of like or say me too to somebody else's question so that it gets bumped up the priority list. What's the next thing you should know about? You can leave questions in either English or French. Enough of us read French that if the question is for someone who doesn't understand the question, we can sort that out. Due to time constraints, we will hear from the speakers first and use any time we have left over for questions. Is everyone on the panel happy with how we're going to proceed? Yes? All right, well then. C'est un grand honneur de vous présenter Dr. Jonathan Frocko, éditeur et traducteur de cet tome, le livre de la Duchesse et autres textes. Dr. Frocko is currently an independent scholar and an active member of the New Chaucer Society. His second book, Faits et gestes de Robin de Bois, which presented Middle English Robin Hood texts in a bilingual edition and translation for students, received the 2018 Lone Medievalist Prize for Scholarship. And earlier this year, he completed the French Agrégation Spéciale examinations in English, for which he ranked first. And I have just realized that having known him entirely online, I never actually checked how I was supposed to pronounce his surname. Have I actually got that right, Jonathan?
You got that right, yeah.
Excellent, rejoice. I leave it in your hands then to introduce your book and the overall project.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone, really, for being here. Merci beaucoup à tous d'avoir répondu présent à cette invitation pour le lancement de ce petit ouvrage, the launch party for this little book, which I'm trying desperately to show to the webcam. So it really all started in Toronto in 2018 during the last New Society Congress. And so there was this discussion with Candace and with artists and with Ruth Evans as well about the necessity to try to reconnect with Europeans that are non-Anglophone Chaucerians, especially with France. And so the idea of doing something to try to attract more French students to medieval English studies, to Chaucerian studies, was mentioned, and so that touched me for an obvious reason. I'm French, I'm a Chaucerian, and there aren't many of us left, and there aren't many of us that are actively doing academic research on Chaucer in France. So I thought that maybe producing a new edition, Chaucer had been translated before in French, but producing an edition that was bilingual with a new translation that tried to respect as much as possible the connection between Middle English and French was important. And so that's how I worked on this edition. And I would really like to thank Classique Garnier and Richard for welcoming this edition in their collection. Merci beaucoup à Classique Garnier et à Richard de m'avoir donné l'opportunité de concrétiser cette édition-là bilingue de Chaucer dans une collection et dans une maison d'édition digne de ce nom.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Merci. Et ensuite, j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir professeur Richard Trachsler, professeur de littérature française et occitane à l'Université de Zurich. Professeur Trachsler dirige au Classique Garnier la collection Textes littéraires au Moyen Âge. In English, that is, Professor Richard Trachsler is professor in French and Occitan literatures at the University of Zurich. He's previously held posts at Göttingen and the Sorbonne, and his research focus has been on disciplinary history, literary narrative, and the editing of medieval texts. Professor Trachsler is the series editor of Classique Garnier's series Textes littéraires au Moyen Âge, in which Dr. Frocko's edition appears. Bienvenue, Professeur Trachsler.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis très honoré de pouvoir participer à cet événement déjà, et puis encore plus honoré, beaucoup plus content encore de pouvoir assister à cette aventure éditoriale qu'est donc cette édition bilingue de Chaucer. Donc merci à vous d'avoir rendu cela possible. Je dirais simplement 2-3 mots à propos de la collection, et puis peut-être je finirai en disant mon impression sur la collaboration, que j'ai vue un peu de loin aussi, de l'apparition de cette édition maintenant qui s'est concrétisée en ce petit livre jaune que nous a montré tout à l'heure Jonathan. Alors, la série donc, des textes littéraires du Moyen-Âge est une série qui est ouverte en principe à toute philologie, à toute langue. Donc, nous publions des textes littéraires, c'est-à-dire on ne va pas publier par exemple des chartes ou des diplômes, mais tout ce qui est écrit est destiné à être lu dans un contexte un tout petit peu poétique, littéraire, etc. Nous l'accueillons volontiers. La série est également ouverte à toutes sortes de langues, je l'ai dit, donc essentiellement, naturellement, c'est du français, mais nous publions aussi du latin médiéval, on publie aussi de l'italien médiéval, on a un peu d'allemand, moyen-allemand aussi, et on a une série à part, donc ça c'est un peu spécial pour du catalan, et donc une première maintenant avec Chaucer, qui est donc notre premier texte anglais. Normalement, les textes français ne sont pas accompagnés d'une traduction, donc on fait un glossaire. Par contre, toutes les autres productions, donc dans d'autres langues, sont accompagnées obligatoirement d'une traduction qui paraît en regard. Donc, je vous ai dit tout à l'heure que nous avons majoritairement des textes français, ce qui est un tout petit peu normal parce que à ce moment-là, nos auteurs arrivent directement avec leur édition toute faite. C'est la même chose aussi pour du latin. Donc, nous avons des éditeurs de textes de latin médiéval qui font paraître chez nous donc l'édition de référence pour ce texte-là. Naturellement, maintenant, pour les autres philologies moderne, la situation est beaucoup plus compliquée parce que nous ne pouvons pas, pour des raisons purement académiques, aspirer à être une collection qui ferait référence, par exemple, pour les éditions de Dante. Non, donc, ce ne serait pas forcément chez nous qu'un éditeur, un futur éditeur de Dante voudrait publier sa dernière édition critique. Donc, ce qu'on a eu souvent comme obstacle, c'était qu'on n'avait pas une édition de référence qui pouvait accompagner donc la traduction. Et nous, on veut quand même fournir un texte fiable, en plus donc de la traduction qui aide à comprendre le texte et d'un appareil de notes qui aide également à comprendre le texte. Et donc, ce que j'ai souvent refusé, donc moi je ne suis que le directeur scientifique, donc les décisions vraiment importantes, ce n'est pas moi qui les prends, je donne juste un avis sur la viabilité d'un projet dans un paysage scientifique que je crois maîtriser un tout petit peu, au moins pour le domaine français. Mais donc, quand je vois arriver des projets où on a, par exemple, on va reprendre une vieille édition du 19e siècle et on va la traduire, et comme ça fera une édition bilingue, je dis non, parce que nous avons pour ambition que le texte qui est traduit est accompagné et traduit également donc une édition de référence fiable. Et là, je dois dire que pour le Chaucer, vous avez trouvé une solution très élégante avec Oxford University Press. Donc, j'étais vraiment ravi que ça puisse se faire et que nous puissions donc donner à lire une édition qui est une édition reconnue, scientifiquement bien établie, et que nous ayons pu nous appuyer donc pour la traduction et l'annotation sur ce texte-là. Donc, ça, c'est souvent un obstacle majeur parce que ça entraîne des difficultés légales pour la maison d'édition. Et donc là, nous l'avons résolu de façon très, très satisfaisante et je suis totalement ravi de cela. Alors ensuite, comment est-ce que j'ai vu arriver le projet? Alors, quand on dirige une collection, enfin, vous le savez tous, on est un tout petit peu sceptique à chaque fois qu'on voit arriver un projet collectif. Hein. Donc, en général, c'est très compliqué et ça entraîne des retards, des délais absolument incroyables. Et donc, quand j'ai vu Jonathan arriver, je me dis, bon, je vais éditer tout Chaucer et je vais traduire tout Chaucer et on sera une équipe gigantesque. Il m'a montré donc, le plan qui existe déjà donc, pour tous les volumes. Hein. Donc, j'ai vu ça. Et bon, bonne chance, Jonathan. Enfin, je n'ai pas dit ça, mais je l'ai pensé. Et parce que, enfin, même, donc, par exemple, des collègues qui essaie de publier un volume pour le deuxième millénaire de la mort d'Ovide. Donc là, on a le temps de planifier les choses. Hein. Ou pour le 700e de la mort de Dante. On peut planifier les choses et curieusement, les collègues n'y arrivent jamais. Donc, parce que justement, il y a trop de collaborateurs, etc. Donc là, je me suis dit, pour Chaucer, je ne vais pas voir ce volume demain. Hein. Et en fait, j'étais très, très surpris de la rapidité, de l'efficacité avec laquelle cette équipe a produit le volume. Donc, dans mon expérience, c'est extrêmement rare. Enfin, je me rappelle qu'on a dû faire des volumes de mélange avec des fausses couvertures parce que le livre physiquement n'était pas prêt. Et il fallait absolument quelque chose pour la cérémonie. Donc, on a fabriqué de faux livres avec des vraies couvertures, un faux livre avec des vraies couvertures. Et donc, pour ce Chaucer, ça a été absolument extraordinaire de voir ce texte d'un auteur absolument majeur. Donc, j'imagine qu'il y avait beaucoup de choses à faire, beaucoup d'annotations, bibliographies, etc. à intégrer. Et donc, cette équipe avec des signatures prestigieuses aussi, je me suis dit, bon, je vais voir comment Jonathan arrive à faire travailler tous ses collègues éminents. Et en fait, ça a très, très bien marché. Donc, je suis vraiment ravi de l'efficacité de cette équipe. Et donc, je vous adresse à tous et à toutes mes félicitations. et en particulier à Jonathan pour cette belle initiative. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Trashler. Notre prochain panéliste est professeur Anthony Bale, président de la New Chaucer Society. Professor Anthony Bale, the president of the New Chaucer Society, will speak to us next. Dr. Bale is Professor of Medieval Studies at Birkbeck University of London and has a wide range of research expertise in medieval literature. Highlights include his work on relations between Christians and Jews in England, his interest in pilgrimage cultures, and his recent book, Margery Kempe, A Mixed Life. Professor Bale, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm absolutely delighted to mark and celebrate this publication and to congratulate Jonathan and the other contributors on what really is a landmark in the publication of Chaucer and for medieval English literature in French. I'm here partly, as Amy said, in my role as the current president of the New Chaucer Society, and we're joined by at least 3 former presidents of the Society, David Wallace, Susan Crane, and Ardis Butterfield, and I think Ruth Evans might be around about somewhere in the attendees. And for those of you who don't know it, the New Chaucer Society is the leading global scholarly society for the teaching and study of literature and culture in the age of Geoffrey Chaucer, so really in kind of 14th and 15th centuries. And we have a very diverse membership that spans the entire world, from New Zealand to Alaska, from Scotland to Turkey to Japan. People from all over the world in various cultural traditions and various language traditions reading Chaucer. I'm sure all of you who are here tonight are aware of the Society's existence, but if you're not, then please check out our website at newchaucersociety.org. But what I really wanted to kind of impress on this event tonight is that a scholarly society like the New Chaucer Society, its work is not simply about, well, it's not at all about maintaining an academic club or an existing academic kind of structure. What people might think of as the ivory tower of something, which is a kind of, professional society around medieval literature, but rather what we really want to do is facilitate all kinds of engagement with medieval literature and culture. And this new edition of Chaucer's works in French is really important to the Society in a couple of ways. First, it helps us with the urgent and vital task of keeping Middle English writing connected with its European and non-Anglophone roots and with European and non-Anglophone audiences today. And this is more important than ever in the age of Brexit, which, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is not going very well, particularly in terms of British-French relations. Chaucer was a profoundly international poet whose reading and writing encompassed so much French, Italian, and Latin literature that if we call him an English poet, we really misunderstand his political and cultural milieu, a milieu that was so closely linked to continental Europe. This accessible, affordable, and reliable new edition of Chaucer in French with the Middle English will, I think, help Chaucer find new audiences today, and help ensure the ongoing internationalism of his writing. And I really hope and expect that this edition will appear on university syllabi and in reading lists all over the French-speaking world. And it's so important to have these kinds of accessible editions of medieval poetry in modern translation in various languages. And I should say, for those of you for whom English isn't your first language, you should know that Chaucer's English is not straightforward for undergraduate students first approaching it from an English language background. And most people from an English speaking background also approach Chaucer in a modern English translation for the first time. So we really need these editions and translations to make wonderful texts approachable. For the New Chaucer Society, this fulfills part of our role as a scholarly society to support publication, republication, and new endeavours of all kinds in furthering the audiences of and the inquiry into medieval culture. And so it's a real pleasure for the Society to endorse Jonathan's edition. And it's just wonderful to hear that the edition was kind of brought into being at the Toronto Congress. often a Congress can feel like it's a somewhat kind of evanescent event that you all get together and then leave, but to think that actually things are generated from this is really fantastic. It's also a pleasure for me to mark this publication individually, as I've had the pleasure of working with Jonathan on the introduction to one of the next volumes, which we'll hear about in a little while, I think, on Chaucer's shorter poems. And many of these poems aren't widely read in Middle English or English, and they show all kinds of versatility and sophistication in Chaucer's writing, including poems, mainly lyrics, ballads, written for members of the court of Richard II, and various translations, fairly direct translations of French poetry by de Guilville and Otto de Grandson and others. So thank you, Jonathan, for giving me a reason to going back to these poems, the shorter poems that I hadn't looked at for quite some time. And I hope helping them reach new audiences. And on behalf of the New Chaucer Society, I'd like to say thank you to Jonathan and to all the contributors to this volume for their incredible work on getting this project together and moving it forward so quickly. So félicitations, and I'll stop there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you again, Professor Bale. To members of the audience, particularly those who joined us after I had given my Zoom webinar intro spiel, if you have questions for any of the speakers, you can put them in the Q&A at any time. Our next speaker will be Professor Estelle Daudet, Professor of Medieval French and Vice Research at the University of Lausanne. Professor Daudet has previously held posts at the Universities of Lille and Grenoble-Alpes. Her research specialities cover literary production and public communications in Francophone Europe between the 13th and 16th centuries. Je vous présente Professeur Estelle Daudet, professeur de français médiéval et vice-rectrice recherche à l'Université de Lausanne. Estelle.
Thank you, Amy. I'm very honored to be taking part in this discussion in which I'm the least competent of speakers, but Jonathan asked me to explore the reason why scholars of Middle French literature still devote little of their work to Chaucer until today, of course, and he also asked me to do it in French, so I will carry on in another language. So, je dois dire qu'en effet, c'est un paradoxe tout à fait réel parce que Chaucer, on le sait, a vécu toute sa vie dans un univers francophone, hein, tant d'un point de vue familial qu'un point de vue professionnel. Il a effectué de nombreuses missions diplomatiques sur le continent. Il a travaillé, bien sûr, en tant qu'écrivain dans une cour où le français était la langue principale. Il a vraiment rencontré des écrivains de première importance, Froissart, Granson, peut-être même Machaut, on ne sait pas, son grand modèle. Donc, c'est vraiment un membre du plus prestigieux réseau de poètes francophones de la fin du XIVe siècle. Et puis finalement, cette appartenance, si l'on veut, ou du moins cette identité fluide de Chaucer, elle est relativement peu prise en compte dans les études en moyen français. Alors pourquoi ce paradoxe? Je vous le dis d'emblée, je pense que ce paradoxe sera sans doute en partie résolu par la magnifique édition et traduction que nous découvrons ce soir, et vraiment tous mes remerciements à Jonathan et à toute l'équipe. Mais pourquoi ce paradoxe? Alors, c'est vrai que je crois que Chaucer est un auteur qui fait beaucoup parler, mais qui fait pas plus forcément débat sur son Englishness. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a eu depuis le 19e siècle, pendant très longtemps, des décennies, il y a vraiment eu des débats, des polémiques entre les critiques, les historiens du français et les historiens de l'anglais sur l'identité de Chaucer. Et puis finalement, ces débats, depuis au moins 40 ans et sans doute bien avant, ils se sont clos avec l'idée que Chaucer, c'est un écrivain anglais qui s'inspire du français, mais c'est the English writer of the Middle Ages. Ça, c'est peut-être un premier obstacle, c'est une victoire. Et puis, c'est aussi dans la littérature anglaise, mais c'est aussi un premier obstacle, et d'autant plus que, bien sûr, on n'est plus du tout aujourd'hui dans la vision nationaliste d'autrefois, Mais il n'empêche que nos images du XIVe siècle, hein, ce siècle de Chaucer, c'est l'émergence des, si je peux dire, nations linguistiques, en tout cas du lien entre la langue et la nation. Et du coup, Chaucer, il est quand même présent dans ce lien entre la langue, la littérature et la nation. Donc, en tout cas, tel que nous, on se l'imagine. Alors, du coup, c'est pour ça que je le trouve extrêmement intéressant à étudier et je ne doute pas que ce nouveau livre avec édition et traduction nous permette de le faire. Une deuxième raison de notre, peut-être de la relative discrétion de Chaucer dans les études de français en France, c'est aussi la langue. Hein, et c'est là où ce livre a vraiment du poids, un rôle à jouer, parce que nous ne travaillons plus sur des pays, mais nous travaillons quand même souvent sur des langues qui sont choisies par les écrivains parce que c'est la matière même de leurs œuvres. Et en particulier dans le cas de Chaucer, ce qui est particulier, c'est pas que seulement c'est un écrivain, c'est que c'est un fondateur de langue littéraire, comme Chrétien de Troyes, comme Gottfried von Strassburg, comme Dante. D'accord ? Et si j'essaie de comparer dans mon expérience des études de français médiéval dans les enseignements en France, je dirais que pour moi, la place jusqu'ici de Chaucer, elle est exactement semblable à celle de Gottfried von Strassburg. C'est-à-dire que, bien sûr qu'on lit leurs livres parce qu'ils travaillent sur des sources françaises, donc on les cite, on les regarde, mais le travail qu'ils font dans la langue anglaise ou allemande, eh bien, on la laisse aux études d'anglais ou d'allemand. Et c'est là où cette traduction, je pense, peut permettre vraiment de changer un petit peu les choses et puis d'approcher davantage justement ce texte original en regard des sources françaises de l'époque et aussi en regard du français moderne. Bien sûr, aujourd'hui, les choses changent, nos approches aussi, et puis on s'intéresse beaucoup à la question des transferts culturels, à la question aussi de ces écrivains passeurs, grand translateur, disait Eustache Deschamps, que ce soit ironique ou non, de Geoffrey Chaucer. Et c'est vrai que Chaucer peut être, je pense, un des représentants du medieval global French, même s'il est beaucoup moins étudié que Marco Polo en ce sens. Alors, on étudie énormément Marco Polo, on étudie beaucoup moins de Chaucer, et là, je pense qu'encore une fois, ce nouveau livre a vraiment un rôle à jouer pour changer cette approche. Et ce n'est pas forcément facile, mais c'est vrai que pourquoi Chaucer n'est pas encore là, parce que au fond, nous, quand on étudie Chaucer jusqu'ici, c'est parce qu'il s'inspire des sources françaises médiévales, des sources en français, des sources en provençal. Et puis les sources, c'est très intéressant à étudier, mais c'est tellement plus intéressant d'étudier un écrivain quand il crée quelque chose à partir des sources. Parce qu'on a cette idée de la littérature aussi comme création, qui, soit dit en passant, est une idée aussi héritée du 19e siècle, puis je ne suis pas sûre que ça s'applique très bien à la littérature médiévale. Mais du coup, maintenant, on a la chance d'avoir à la fois ce texte de Chaucer, sa traduction, et puis donc on peut peut-être sans doute aller plus loin que le réduire à quelqu'un qui a utilisé les sources françaises pour créer une œuvre, mais regarder de plus près comment il a participé à cette translation, cette translation entre les cultures. Et ça, je pense que ça vraiment va aider à développer une vision de la littérature, non pas comme dans un silo linguistique, mais vraiment une littérature comme un lieu d'échange. Et donc vraiment, je voudrais remercier très amicalement Jonathan et toute l'équipe de cette magnifique entreprise qui nous ouvre des perspectives nouvelles, y compris sur les études, non seulement d'anglais médiéval, mais je veux dire de français médiéval également. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Daudet. Nous entendons maintenant des experts chauceriens qui ont fourni les introductions scientifiques à des textes individuels dans ces volumes. Le premier de ces spécialistes est professeur Ardis Butterfield de l'Université de Yale, qui parlerait le livre de la Duchesse. We will now hear from the Chaucerian experts who contribute specialist introductions to individual texts in the volume. The first of these speakers is Ardis Butterfield, Professor of English at Yale University. Professor Butterfield is an expert in 13th to 16th century literature and music in both French and English. She's a past president of the New Chaucer Society and the author of a great many scholarly works, including the notable monograph, The Familiar Enemy, Chaucer, Language and the Nation in the 100 Years' War. Professor Butterfield will speak to us about the Book of the Duchess.
Thank you very much, Amy, for your very kind words now and this wonderful invitation created by Jonathan's great work. Je veux commencer par remercier chaleureusement Jonathan pour son travail extraordinaire dans la production de cette merveilleuse traduction de la poésie de Chaucer. Tous les Chauceriens lui sont profondément redevables. I will now continue in English. The Book of the Duchess, I suppose I have three things to say, and I've been really interested to hear what Estelle has been saying as well. So some of it may be in response to her, but I really wanted to start by saying the Book of the Duchess is an Anglo-French poem. This means it has a very special relationship with French poetry. Chaucer is translating French poetry into English, demonstrating in the process his deep affection and admiration for his fellow vernacular poets, Guillaume de Machaut and Jean Froissart, and before them, a work that they and many other poets were all indebted to, Le Roman de la Rose. Yet, the situation is complex, just as the relation between the English and the French and the English is complex, full of affection, admiration, humor, and yes, some rivalry and difference. Because in this moment of homage, Chaucer is also asserting his own vernacular moment, English, as it were daring to speak with an international voice. And what better way to do this, he seems to have thought, than to produce a poem in which nearly 1,000 out of 1,300 lines are paralleled with French poems. The second thing I want to say is that the Book of the Duchess is not extraordinary only because it is Anglo-French. It is a remarkable, moving exploration of death and grief. The Duchess, who it's all about, Blanche of Lancaster, wife of John of Gaunt, died young, probably of plague, at the age of only 22, leaving 3 young children. In a dream-like structure, this is a poem about the writing of a poem about a dream of a death. It's full of mystery, inarticulacy, emotional reflection that can barely speak. And so my third thing is, it's therefore a poem that speaks so much to us now as we grapple with a world of contagious disease, war, and grief. I recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it, since it offers the reader, through translation, through the mode of dream and of poetry, an experience that helps us across the centuries to understand secret places of sympathy. Merci à tous et surtout à Jonathan.
Merci and thank you, Professor Butterfield. Our next expert is David Wallace, Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He too is a past president of the New Chaucer Society and also past president of the Medieval Academy of America and a specialist in the reception of Chaucer's works. Among his notable scholarship is the 2017 volume Geoffrey Chaucer, A New Introduction. Professor Wallace will speak to us about the House of Fame. Notre prochain expert est David Wallace, professeur d'anglais à l'Université de Pennsylvanie. Il parlera sur les palais de renom. Bienvenue, Professor Wallace.
Thank you very much. So if I'm nervous after, we're going to turn my volume up just a hair, I think. There we go. There we go. So if I'm nervous after Ardis, I think that's mimetically appropriate because Ardis is in every sense on French ground with the Book of the Duchess. She's expert in French. The poem, as Ardis says, is really suffused with French and has a very powerful relation. And The House of Fame, the poem I've looked at, carries that forward, but has become cognizant also of Italian as well, following 2 journeys to Italy in the 1370s. And this has thrown Chaucer back into looking at the resources of English and finding English poetry eccentric and retarded. Eccentric because it stuck out geographically, eccentric in the far western reaches of Europe, and retarded because France and Italy have got these extraordinary native vernacular traditions well developed. And so the encounter with Dante throws him back into reflection, I think throws him into kind of neurotic forms of self-parody. And he still maintains the octosyllabic couplets of the French tradition, still maintains a very, very strong relation to French poetics, particularly Machaut, I think, never goes out of fashion in thinking about a first-person persona. But it's come across Dante. And throughout the House of Fame, you can see, that as Dante begins by following Virgil, so Chaucer begins by following Virgil, but he says, he will now sing, if he can, a tale of Aramis and the man. I mean, that's hardly Dantean resonance, and the if he can is the nervous squeak there. And then by book 3, where Dante begins with this fantastic address to Apollo, O buono Apollo, all'ultimo lavoro, fammi del tuo valor si fatto vaso, come domandi a dar l'amato a loro, that kind of resonance and amplitude. Chaucer, in his squeaky octosyllabics, promises if Apollo helps him out to come kiss the tree. Dante will crown himself like Napoleon in Notre Dame in 1806, but Chaucer will kiss the tree. So he's forced into forms of self-parody, taking stock of what English is. Later on, Chaucer workshops his way forward, and I think Candace's poem, Annalida Archita, can be seen as a kind of workshopping poem, thinking forward. Okay, what does English need to do? Does it expand its line? What does it do? By the time we get to Susan Crane's Parliament of Fowls, we've reached a kind of formal perfection, I think. A beautiful synthesis of French and Italian models, but I see the House of Fame as a real mental breakdown in verse, a form of neurosis, at which French critics are very good in helping us understand. It's one of the great strengths of French criticism. My dear colleague Jean-Michel Rabatet has written a piece recently called, it's on Chaucer, Eliot, Pound, Hegel, and Derrida. And Jean-Michel, trained in Paris, knew Lacan, knew Derrida, and during the lockdown, he just decided to start reading Chaucer. He read the whole of Troilus and Cressida, and he has amazing things to say in a short piece that he wrote. So this is one way I think Chaucer will really benefit from analysis by French critics and French critical traditions. I'll say one last thing, just a wonderful rhyme at the end of the House of Fame when he wanders out of Fame's house into a landscape in which he hears a kind of swooshing sound, a noise, and you need a rhyme for noise, and there aren't many in English, so he says Oise, which is a river just north of Paris. I don't know what the modern French pronunciation would be, but it puts him on French ground. This is very interesting, and the sound of the swooshing of this revolution of this 60-foot house of rumour is likened to the sound of a stone thrown from a trebuchet, like that. And so, interestingly, he puts himself on French ground, and he says that noise could be heard all the way to Rome. So this is, I think, is like a historical neurosis. Here we are in French ground. You can hear this all the way to Rome. We're after 1378 with the Papal Schism. France and England are following separate popes. And so the kind of uncertainties of his poetic, I think, are also the uncertainties of what is our relation to France after 1378. So again, I think our French colleagues are going to have some really interesting things to say about that. So thank you. That's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallace. And where have I put the list of what I'm doing next? Here it is. From the House of Fame, we will be moving on to one of Chaucer's rather less formal works. No, rather less famous. That was supposed to be a pun. Oh dear. From the House of Fame to a less famous work. Our next speaker, Professor Candace Barrington, will speak about Annelida and Arcite. Dr. Barrington is Professor of English at Central Connecticut State University. She's co-director of the Global Chaucers Project and has recently co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Medieval English Law and Literature. And I'll give her an extra citation out of pure self-interest. Amongst her earlier work, the volume American Chaucers is really fascinating and has been absolutely incredibly useful to me starting this Commode project on the reception of Chaucer. Je vous présente Professeur Candace Barrington de l'Université de l'État central de Connecticut. Elle co-dirige le projet Global Chaucers et ce soir, elle parlerait de Annelida et Arcite. Professeur Barrington, c'est notre plaisir de vous entendre.
Thank you very much, Amy. Jonathan, I want to start just by congratulating you on this wonderful project. I'm going to disagree with you, though, about the where some of these ideas began. I'm going to say they started in London in 2016, and that's when I first met you. And we may not have talked about a translation of the complete works of Chaucer into French, but we did talk about this the ways that we could think about this rich conversation between English and French. And so thank you so much for, I can't tell you how many times I've suggested things to people and nothing came of it. And it's really wonderful to have actually something tangible and so wonderful come of it. I'm also really glad to be part of this group. I am the only person here who hasn't been a president of the New Chaucer Society. So that's my distinguishing mark. But I'm glad to say that I'm a proud member of the New Chaucer Society, and it's been supportive of the Global Chaucers Project in many ways. When Jonathan Shu and I started the Global Chaucers Project about a decade ago, we were particularly interested in French translations. When we started describing what we wanted to do with it, we marked out French and Italian translations as a particular interest to us, because what does it mean to be moving back into a language that had actually been the root of much of what Chaucer had done? And so, how does that happen, and what how does this several centuries difference in the languages, how does that develop it? And so I'm very excited to see the translation and what it can tell me about the original and what's happened there. So I have lots of selfish reasons to be excited about this project, but that is one of them. And it's also, I'm excited about the way Jonathan's continued this chain of translations that Chaucer was just in the middle of, right? He didn't start it. He reaches back and he pulls things that he's translating that have been translated, and then he's in the middle, and then it's continued on. So I think Jonathan makes himself a nice heir to in this chain. I also forgot to tell you, Jonathan, I send greetings from many of Chaucer's other translators who couldn't be here. But Ali Reza and Iran sends his greetings. John in South Africa sends his greetings. Chico in Brazil sends his greetings. And Koichi in Japan sends his greetings. So there are many other translators who are working on projects similar to yours, and they really understand the Herculean task of what you've achieved. So congratulations from them. When I turn to thinking about what it means to think about Annalita and Arquita for this introduction, I was really interested in the role of translation in it. So Jonathan was translating, but how had translation shaped the poem itself? And the poem opens up, announcing that it's going to be a translation. It's going to be a translation from Statius. And it even gives us some lines from Statius's Thebaid. But then it immediately drops Statius, and we start getting many references to Boccaccio's work. And then that gets dropped. So what we end up with is a false translation or a faux translation, a work that pretends to be a translation, but is not. And so it's again, part of that anxiety that David was talking about, that, how do you present something in English that stands alone without really having a source? Well, you pretend like there's a source. And that's one of the ways that that was one of Chaucer's favorite techniques. I think he never really dropped it. He uses it all the way through his works. It's a place where he's experimenting with meters. Some of these meters come from the French and some of them come from the Italian, but they come, and some of them he makes up himself. So it's a work that we can see a lot going on with thinking about how translation allows him to be creative. So when I think about you translating this, Jonathan, I hope that it allowed you to be just a little bit creative and that you didn't feel absolute obedience to the original text, because that would have been absolutely in the wrong spirit of things. And then I hope it continues to excite you and provide inspiration for your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Barrington. And the final poem in Tome 1 is The Parliament of Fowls. By reason of her expertise, but complemented by the very good fortune of an avian surname, we have Professor Susan Crane to speak briefly about this poem. Professor Crane is Emeritus Professor in English and Comparative Literature at the University of Columbia and another past president of the New Chaucer Society. Her research specialties include medieval insular bilingualism, gender studies, and the representations of animals in medieval literature. This last was the subject of her notable monograph, Animal Encounters. La dernière experte est Susan Crane, professeure éméritée d'anglais et de littérature comparée à l'Université de Columbia, qui parlerait de le Parlement des oiseaux. Professor Crane.
Thank you. And thank you especially to Jonathan and to Richard Traxler for their part in making this volume possible. I thought I would aim myself at the French readers who might watch this video and decide whether or not to get this volume. So I too have just 3 points to make, like so many of us. And the first echoes Ardis's point that Chaucer's works are an important part of the French cultural history, that they really are in that cultural history, not on the outside of it. For the Parliament of Fowls, the salient aspect are Chaucer's career-spanning interest in the roman de la rose and his contributions to French literary forms, such as the Question d'amour and bird parliament poetry. The Parliament of Fowls is probably the first of many poems set on Valentine's Day, many of them in French. The roundel that closes the poem is, of course, a French form with a melody that is said to be from France. These indications of live performance on Valentine's Day align with the continental trend toward more and more lavish court performances at festivals and weddings, performances that left traces in the poetry of Machaut, Deschamps, and Froissart, as well as in Chaucer's Parliament. My second point is on the history of Chaucer criticism. Chaucer is distinctive. Perhaps his genius is most profoundly expressed in how deeply his poetry responds to years of reading and rereading, thinking and rethinking. In this, he surpasses all poets, in my experience, except for Shakespeare. I wager that new readers in France will return to the Parliament of Fowls again and again, discovering each time new potential, new attractions, new thought experiments. Here, I want to mention my bibliography and see if I can share the screen to quickly illustrate. Desktop? No, it looks like I'm not going to be able to share my screen. Let's see, allow Zoom to share your screen, open system preferences. Yes, we could have rehearsed this, couldn't we? All right, I'm going to do this narratively instead of by sharing my screen. In my introduction, I trace a history of criticism from about 1920 to 2020. And the bibliography is made up of just a few works from each period of criticism. It turned out in the volume, these are organized alphabetically, but if we were to organize them chronologically, they would offer a guided tour of the poem's radical openness to reception. For the earliest writers, Chamberlain and McCall, oh, thank you, Amy, that's great. For the earliest writers in the bibliography, Chamberlain and McCall, this poem is crucially a coherent Christian and philosophical vision that celebrates the celestial design of the creator. Later in the 20th century, as exemplified by David Ayres and Kathleen Davis in the volume's bibliography, the poem's civic descriptions undermine its assertions of universal harmony. Instead, political critique, social dissonance, the traffic in women complicate the Parliament's commentary on civic life. Still more recently, theories of affects, genders, and environments have turned away from the poem's apparently masculine focus toward its substantial interests in non-masculine and non-human registers of being. Okay, thank you so much, Amy. That's my point about the historical pattern. But bouncing off this tripartite history, bouncing off that, my final point is that French readers can experience this history all at once, cumulatively and ahistorically, as they read the Parliament of Fowls for themselves. To characterize Chaucer's particular genius, I can't think of a better term than bricolage, both in the traditional workman's sense of a constructional method and in Levi-Strauss's sense of an intellectual tactic or a mythographer's tactic. Chaucer constructs his works using myriad treatises and texts, aphorisms, bits of liturgy, bits of slang, hammered up into unprecedented new things, unique in their aesthetics and in their aspirations. These odd new things can breathe and survive in our mental atmospheres because Chaucer is also an intellectual bricoleur, providing his creatures with perspectival multiplicity that invites thought rather than prescribing conclusions. Chaucer's works are Argus-eyed, and they can meet our gazes across centuries and continents, and now new gazes, thanks to the Garnier edition and Jonathan Fuoco's excellent organization of this project. Thank you all.
Thank you very much again, Professor Crane. We are approaching the end of the evening and we are running fairly tight to time, but if you have burning questions, do drop them into the Q&A and we will address as many as we can. Before that though, I want to say to Jonathan, I wish this book had existed when I was an undergraduate. That might sound a bit odd because, as you can tell by now, I am not fluent in French and I have never been fluent in French. I may yet be proficient, but it's a bit of a stretch. I was, however, a double major in French and medieval studies, and the Book of the Duchess was the first Middle English I had encountered. I would absolutely have used a book like this in Australia in 2005 as a supplementary crib, as a way of bridging a gap between Old English, which I had been learning for some semesters, and the modern French that I was already learning. Middle English with the assistance of modern French would have actually genuinely been incredibly useful to me. And I believe that the rest of this book, and perhaps more likely, many of the coming volumes will be incredibly useful to my fellow teachers of Chaucer in Switzerland, not only those in Suisse romande, because many of our students in German-speaking Switzerland have at least sort of B-level French and may be able to make use of French language resources as a supplement to English language resources. So, Jonathan, can you now tell us a little bit about the next stages in your translation project?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on Troilus and Crusader. Hard at work on this one, which is a big poem, as you all know. So that's volume 2. And then we will have 3 other volumes to go through the whole of Chaucer's works. So volume 3 will have the Legend of Good Women and the short poems introduced by Anthony. Volume 4 will be dedicated to the Canterbury Tales, another big poem, and I think I'm going to spend a few months, if not years, on the Canterbury Tales, especially on my own. But and then the 5th volume, which has been added rather recently to the edition, will focus on Boès and the Treaty of on the Astrolabe, which wasn't planned at the beginning, but we've added it to the edition. So that should be published in the near future. So it's a question of a few years at least until I reach volume 5. So that's that's going to keep me busy.
That sounds fantastic. And I am particularly excited about the Canterbury Tales, needless to say, although I feel like with our luck, it will in fact be after the Commode project has ended that's out. Does anybody on the panel or any attendees have any burning, oh, Susan has a burning question. You're on mute.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to mention that I was really struck when Estelle Daudet said that we are actually part of the problem for Chaucer in France, in that we made such a huge campaign of making Chaucer a quintessentially English poet and the founder of our English language. So we could continue with Candace's help and Artis's help to try to undo that very provincial version of Chaucer that grew as part of our academic respectability in the 19th century and even into the 20th. I do think it's ironic that basically the reasons Chaucer is not so studied in France are English reasons rather than French reasons. Some of them.
I think so. I was just an impression. I don't want to say, I don't think you are guilty. You know, it's simply the critical tradition, the historiography. And when you see simply the evolution between the debates during the 19th century around, for example, the Sandrart book about Chaucer being part of a tradition of a trouvère and so on, there were so many very even violent debates, because there were, of course, nationalistic debates. And well, I had this impression, but I'm not a Chaucerian, of course, it's just an impression that, well, slowly these debates, well, calm down somehow. And we are now absolutely convinced that, okay, Chaucer is an English writer, which doesn't mean it is not interesting, right? Oh, not at all, just the contrary. But this, I think it had a little overshadowed the fact that Jonathan edition and your translation, put highlights again that Chaucer had this sort of fluid identity, if you want. But anyway, he was part of this network of French-speaking writers, and this fact had been a little overshadowed. That's just what I wanted to suggest.
Right. And I think Jonathan's prefaces have encouraged us also to reinforce that sense. So another way this edition will be useful is making that argument.
I think that's absolutely the case. And I think in many ways that nationalist sense of Chaucer, in fact, even predates the strange 19th century push. David Wallace, I believe you have something.
Just a point to go along with that is that the overwhelming amount of critical energy in the United Kingdom, especially Oxford, has been invested in the early English Text Society. It's still the most extremely prestigious. Oxford is by far the biggest place. And most of the really innovative works of Chaucer criticism have been written in the United States, or people who end up in the United States. So it's a very interesting kind of commitment to texts that kind of reinforce that 19th century paradigm of a nationalist literature. So I think the United States gets a pass here. I think the United States has done a lot for the internationalized Chaucer.
It's also true that perhaps the United States' approach to, I mean, what Candace calls sort of the American Chaucer, the Pacific Chaucer, can be in itself quite strange. Professor Butterfield?
Oh, just can't resist jumping in. I mean, of course, the history of connection between England and France is, goes back so far in the medieval period. So it's very interesting how these histories come together in more recent histories, isn't it? So yeah, a 20th century American scholar will have a different connection than a 20th century British scholar. And all of these things are fascinating to trace. For that matter, Swiss scholars and German scholars and so on, you know, all people's attitudes towards national languages are very, very enmeshed and hard to kind of stand back from. But it's yeah, I will never cease to be totally intrigued as to how people, you know, you see language and see language as a means of understanding identity, let's call it that. I mean, we don't have to call, you know, at different phases it's been national identity, but I think in any chronology, identity is for large or for small, something of what's going on.
I did, in shameless promotion, I know we have coming up on the Commode blog a guest post from, I think, Mary Bale, who's working on Chaucer in like early 20th century German textbooks. And to come back around to, rather than wandering off the topic too enormously, one of the things that I keep thinking when thinking about Jonathan's project is that the availability of something like this, a parallel English and French text, is going to allow engagement with Chaucer in these contexts that are often probably not appreciated that much by people who are interested in English schooling history, in a way that it's a text that may have been somewhat difficult to access for people who are specialists in German educational history, for instance. And I do think also it's probably worth remembering that this is not only opening up the text to French scholars, but that it may be very to the Francophonie in Africa, but also to other people in Europe who may simply find it easier. You can read with two cribs. I learned Old French with a modern French and a modern English beside myself. There will be people in Spain who will be able to make use of this book, I'm sure. Jonathan, do you have anything to add here?
Not really, no, just maybe thanking you all once again. I mean, I feel like a kid brought in front of the grown-ups to speak. So it's it's rather moving for me to hear so many nice things about this work, which has kept me busy for the last few months. And I honestly can't believe my luck that you all accepted to contribute introductions, that you all accepted to work with me on this, you trusted me on this, and that you've accepted to spend an hour tonight or this afternoon with us. So thank you very much for everything that's been said, and thank you for your work and your presence.
All right, we should be ready to let you go. We did receive a message, incidentally, from Richard Strachler saying that he had to leave shortly before 8 p.m. Congratulations, Jonathan. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations from on behalf also of Mary Flannery, who had to go and put a small child to bed, I believe, and from a great many other colleagues in Switzerland who were unable to be here. And thank you all for attending. Thank you, attendees. Merci, chers invités et chers panélistes. Pour mes fautes en français et de formalité, pardonnez-moi ma terrible australianité et ne blâmez pas Jonathan. Félicitations encore, Jonathan, pour le lancement de cette tome. Thank you again, everybody, and I think we'll call it an end here. Good evening.
Good.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.